So welcome back to Monitoring Clinical Trials. This week we're going to be talking about remote monitoring, or what some people call centralized monitoring. I'm Steve Pope. So let's start by looking at the purpose of remote monitoring, and this comes from the document Guidance for Industry, Oversight of Clinical Investigations, a Risk-Based Approach to Monitoring, and this comes from Section 2 of the FDA's rationale for risk-based monitoring. So basically the FDA is issuing this guidance to provide current recommendations regarding monitoring practices and to encourage sponsors to consider a change in approach to monitoring. Now, most sponsors have embraced this. Most CROs have embraced this. Some of you even work in this area in your work out there in the field. So basically what we're doing is we're implementing a method strategy, if you will, of monitoring this based upon risk as being kind of an indicator of how often we ought to be monitoring sites and what we ought to be looking for. And so that whole boils into this whole issue of centralized monitoring, or what others call remote monitoring. And we're going to go into some of the specifics of that in this lecture. So I'm going to leave the purpose up there because I think it's important for you to be able to read that and understand that, and certainly understand where the FDA is coming from in providing this guidance. Our learning objectives include discuss remote monitoring fundamentals and what's involved in that, discuss best practice in remote monitoring. We're also going to compare and contrast remote monitoring versus on-site monitoring. What we've been talking about up to this point has been mostly on-site monitoring, so we'll kind of divert from that a little bit, kind of explain how one supports the other. And then finally, we're going to cite how remote monitoring supports a risk-based monitoring strategy. So I think once we go through each of these learning objectives, you'll have a much better view, much better understanding of what remote monitoring is, what it involves, and how it fits into our overall monitoring strategy. So from our oversight document, centralized monitoring is defined as a remote evaluation carried out by sponsor personnel or representatives. These could be clinical monitors that go on site. These could be data management people. They could be statisticians. I would include medical monitors into that category as well. And these people are at locations other than the sites, the clinical sites, at which the clinical investigation is being conducted. So centralized monitoring processes can provide many of the capabilities of on-site monitoring as well as additional capabilities. And we'll go over a few of those. So we've talked up to this point about monitoring on-site, where you're there at the clinical site talking with the staff that's there that's actually conducting the trial, and that's where most of your on-site monitoring is going to take place. So this will just be performing some of the same or similar tasks, but you'll be doing it in a remote fashion rather than doing it on site. So let's look at remote monitoring fundamentals. And I think the first thing we have to do is to think in terms of being completely remote, where we're not at the site, we don't have visual confirmation of things going on at the site. This is also going to involve remote staff, and these could be staff that are based anywhere in the world. They can be reviewing information, reviewing data, reviewing tasks that the site has performed, all done on a remote fashion. So this is going to involve some tools that in most cases you already use. For example, your EDC tool or your IWRS tool. You get a lot of valuable information from your IWRS platform and from your electronic data capture platform. So where all your clinical data is going to be stored there. But you've also got access to systems such as lab portals where you can view lab data, you can view other pieces that are associated with that. You also have vendor procedure portals, things like ECGs, where you can actually view those where the site has performed these ECGs and you can review them remotely. You've got tools like eConsent, which is an extremely valuable tool. Now using eConsent, you can, someone remotely can monitor that, can determine whether or not the subject signed the proper consent form, what the date and time stamp of the signature was, who consented the subject, were they authorized to consent the subject. All of that can be done using these electronic consents. So we're seeing more and more of these types of tools in our trials. You can also use remote monitoring to complement what you're doing with your on-site monitoring strategy. We'll get into more of that as we go along. But the important takeaway is that this is quickly becoming accepted practice in trial monitoring. So every pharma company, every CRO has embraced this. They've set up teams to study it, to implement it, and it really is going to be the method in which we monitor trials as we're going forward. It doesn't mean we're putting the CRA out of business. Far from it. In fact, the CRA job is going to become even more complex because now you've got these other members of your team that you're going to be dealing with, and you're going to be asked to be involved in this process as well. So we're not getting rid of on-site monitoring, we're just adapting some of the tools to better monitor the sites with greater efficiency and with less cost. So one of the benefits to remote monitoring fundamentals is that we're able to adapt the role of the site monitor, the person that's going out to the site, to one that's focused less on 100% source data verification in favor of a holistic review and risk identification. So now that person can spend less time just confirming and verifying each individual data point, and they can spend more time working with the site, identifying things they're having difficulty with, impacting subject enrollment, impacting retention, impacting things on the regulatory end of things that could be real risks for the site. So it's very important that the monitor be able to do that. You may remember in my very first lecture I said that one of the things that a monitor has to do is they have to think of themselves as a site manager, that one of their roles is to go out there and help that site be successful. We want them to enroll eligible subjects. We want them to produce quality data. We want them to follow the protocol. We want them to perform everything according to GCP standards and guidelines. We want them to be successful. They will make money, the sponsor will be happy with them, and they'll want to do more studies for that sponsor. So it's important that monitors be able to spend time working with their sites in that capacity to be able to help them succeed. Our next bullet item is going to be we're allocate resources based on risk instead of predetermined frequency. Most of the time, when we've talked about this earlier, you've got a monitoring frequency plan where a monitor goes out every 5 weeks or every 6 weeks or whatever the frequency may be, and this kind of melds that into more of a risk-based or more of a data-driven based strategy. So now, if we identify that a site is having problems, for example, we may want to monitor that site more often than a specified duration. If we discover that sites are doing very well and we don't see very many problems, we may not have to monitor those sites as frequently as we thought that we might. So that's impacting how we go about doing our on-site monitoring. And then finally, it's improving the efficiency of the overall monitoring effort. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's very beneficial. And I think that as you get involved in doing some monitoring tasks, you're going to learn, you're going to see the same thing in your role. So let's talk about what can be monitored remotely. Well, there are quite a few things we can monitor remotely. For example, we can monitor data trends. We can have access to the EDC system and determine, for example, what type of adverse events seem to be common. We can also determine what type of errors the sites are producing. Normally what will happen is once we start seeing some data get into our database, we're going to begin to see some trends emerge. For example, what data is missing? Are there any outliers? Are there systematic errors? That's very important because a lot of times we may have edit checks or other things that are impacting how we review our data, and they may contain errors. So it's good to find those early in the process. We can also look at site performance metrics, things like the number of screen fails that they have, the number of withdrawals that they have. Do they have any delays in data entry? What kind of deviations are we seeing? These are all very important, and these are things that we want to get a grasp of very early, as soon in the life cycle as possible. If we've got a very large trial with dozens of sites and dozens or even hundreds of patients, we want to be able to see these trends and identify them as soon as possible during our trial so that we can correct things as we need to. We can also look at critical data where source is available. For example, we may have access to electronic medical records. We may have access to lab reports or vendor data that can help us identify certain critical data in our trial without having to send somebody out to a site. And that helps us identify it sooner, hopefully, and with less expense than the expense of having someone travel out to the site. We can also do a regulatory document review. One of the big things we're seeing out there is a lot of sites are moving towards electronic investigator site files. They're creating their own trial master files or CTMS systems. I've used some of these, and some of them are very good. Some of them probably not so good. But the advantage is that some of this can be done remotely. Some of it can be done by getting access to the site's systems that they're using. So these are some of the things that we can begin to monitor on a remote fashion. So let's discuss best practice in remote monitoring. So the first thing we want to talk about is that our remote monitoring strategy must complement our on-site monitoring. We don't want to have a lot of duplicate tasks, duplication of effort, and sometimes that can occur when the on-site monitor is not familiar with what the remote monitor is doing. That can, a lot of times they can cover the same ground at the site, and we want to avoid that. It needs to include tasks that can be monitored without on-site presence, things like the electronic investigator site file. As I mentioned earlier, many sites are moving to these products, to these technologies, and this can help us monitor these regulatory files on a remote fashion. Things like delegation of task log. We can ask the site to email us their delegation of their site delegation log. And we can begin to review that and make sure that people that have been delegated certain tasks are indeed eligible to perform those tasks. We can identify a number of errors just by having access to that soon in the process and eliminate those errors. We can do query resolution. We can do subject visit schedules. We can see when subjects are coming in when they might be out of window, and we can help, correct that. We can also identify data trends earlier. That's very important. We want to see what those trends are as soon in our trial as we can. And then finally, it's going to reduce the risk by identifying work process gaps. So if we identify things that sites are having trouble with, that can help us correct those things as early as possible, kind of get them back on the right track. So that can be part of our best practice model. So let's compare and contrast remote monitoring versus on-site monitoring. So it's helpful to identify some tasks that monitors are going to do when they go out on their monitoring visits. For example, on-site tasks, they're going to review the paper informed consent form. Most sites are still going to use paper consent forms. As I mentioned earlier, the electronic consents are kind of emerging and becoming an accepted technology, but in most cases, many of you are going to be reviewing paper consent forms. And that's something that's going to stay at the site. They're not ever going to send that anywhere. You're going to have to physically go there in order to review it. You're also going to conduct investigational product accountability. We've already had some lessons on that. You're going to go out there and count the number of bottles they have, see what they have in inventory, all that stuff. And that's very difficult to do if you're not on site. You're also going to have to assess the site facilities. You can't do that unless you travel to the site and you see their pharmacy, you see their laboratory, you see their exam rooms, you see the other components of the site where they store things. You've got to be able to review that. Then you've got to review subject source data. That subject source data is going to remain at the site. Now they may be able to scan and email some of that to you in a remote fashion and redact whatever personal health information is on there that needs to be redacted. But for the most part, you're going to need to do that while you're physically on the site. So if we look at the off-site tasks, these would include things like reviewing data trends, reviewing site staff training and qualifications. That can be done remotely. Assess protocol compliance. You can do that, do a lot of that remotely. You can review enrollment performance, the number of screen fails they've got. Are they enrolling eligible subjects? That can all be reviewed on a remote basis. So these are some of the breakdowns of on-site tasks versus off-site tasks. So let's cite how remote monitoring supports a risk-based monitoring strategy. So first, it assists with targeted on-site monitoring visits that are risk-oriented. Now what we mean by that is we're sending somebody out to the site. We've employed a risk-based strategy by determining what types of risks would initiate an on-site visit. And then we're using our risk-based monitoring strategy to assist in that. We're using remote monitoring to facilitate, that whole process. We're also going to identify performance issues sooner than on-site monitoring. So, if we're waiting for a monitor to go out to a site, then we're not able to identify certain issues that the site may be having. So our remote monitoring strategy can assist in that. We're not obstructed by geographical issues. We can monitor remotely from anywhere in the world. There is no obstruction. We're not obstructed by time and distance. We can monitor these sites, anywhere around the world. In fact, that's one reason why so many CROs have operations around the world, is so basically they can facilitate an almost 24/7 type of operation of monitoring sites. We can support more complex trials. For example, trials involving vulnerable populations. More and more trials are becoming far more complex, and that means any vulnerable population that we're using, children, for example, are exposed to even more risk with the level of complexity of some of these trials. So our remote monitoring strategy can help facilitate that and help reduce that risk. We can review a large quantity of data is facilitated by use of centralized monitoring tools. So we can dump, a lot of information out of our EDC database and see what every site is doing. Whereas if we're an on-site monitor, we're probably only looking at what that individual site that we're working with is doing. And so we may not see things going on at other sites that might impact what we're doing, what's going on at this site. So you have some reading assignments for the week. First of all, the Guidance for Industry Oversight of Clinical Investigations. That's the document that I've primarily cited here in this lecture. So I'd like for you to take a look at that document. I don't expect you to read every single word of it, but I do expect you to kind of peruse it, understand what information is based in there. Then we have a couple of other articles that I'd like for you to read. There's an article called Risk-Based Monitoring, Understanding the Future of Clinical Trial Monitoring. I think you'll find that to be very interesting. Centralized versus on-site monitoring, a sponsor's balancing act. We're getting into how certain sponsors are implementing this and what they need to be thinking about. We also have updates to the ICH E6 good clinical practice, which is what we've been focusing on in this course. I think the article there will kind of help you, sort of see what the major impacts are. And then finally, we've got competencies for the changing role of the clinical study monitor, implementing a risk-based approach to monitoring. And you'll find that article at the link that I've provided here. So just open up that link and you'll be able to see it online. And then finally, for your online assignment for this week, I want you to imagine that you are a project manager managing a large clinical trial involving over 500 subjects at more than 75 U.S. sites, so a good-sized trial. And I want you to discuss how you would assess and implement a risk identification strategy before the study begins and how you would evaluate its effectiveness. So think about all the things we talked about earlier about risk. Things like, site capability, time, complexity of the trial. All of those things that we've talked about earlier, think about that and think about how you would come up with a strategy. You're probably going to have to think about it a little bit. But I think with what you've gone over, what you've learned here, and what you're going to learn in your readings this week, I think it'll become a little bit clearer for you. And then I want you to post your assessment in the discussion forum for the week. And I would like for you to limit your response to fewer than 250 words. I'm not looking for some big research paper. I don't want that. I want you to boil it down to maybe 3 or 4 items that you would zero in on. Tell me what your thinking is on that and how you would go about implementing that and evaluating whether or not that strategy, that risk identification strategy, is working for you. So if you have questions, post your questions out there on Moodle. You can put them in the questions for the instructor. That way everybody can see what my answer is. So good luck to you. I think you'll enjoy this week, and I'll see you out there on the discussion forum.